And now we enter Roman numeral 4, the dual court system. When we say that the U.S. has a dual court system, what we're talking about is the fact that there's two competing, not competing tracks, but two parallel tracks. There's the state court system and there's the federal court system. State being each individual state system and federal being what the U.S. government's court system works, basically. So basically, again, you've got two different sets of courts that are operating parallel to each other. To understand which court you would go to, whether it be a state court or a federal court, you have to understand what jurisdiction is. Jurisdiction is the ability of a court to hear a case. Again, jurisdiction is the ability of a court to hear a case. Jurisdiction is the ability of a court to hear a case. There are a couple of things that help to... There's two basic types. There's original jurisdiction, who hears the case first. And then there's appellate jurisdiction. Appellate jurisdiction is once a case has been decided, you can appeal it. So original jurisdiction is just whoever hears the case first, whether it be state court or national court. Appellate jurisdiction, on the other hand, is after a case has been decided, you can appeal it. Appellate and appeal are two sides of the same coin. An appellate court is above the original jurisdiction. Appellate jurisdiction is above original jurisdiction. In an appellate jurisdiction, all you're determining is whether or not the original case was performed correctly. You're not making any judgments about the guilt or innocence or validity of the case. You're simply doing judgment about the actual process of the court, if that makes sense. Where things get problematic is when you get concurrent jurisdiction. Concurrent jurisdiction is when more than one court has a legitimate say on the matter, when more than one court could theoretically claim jurisdiction. This is, again, called concurrent jurisdiction. Concurrent jurisdiction is when more than one court has a legitimate claim on it. Again, concurrent jurisdiction is when more than one court has a legitimate claim on the case. To resolve the disputes, you've got sort of the simple fact is, where does it take place? Obviously, a case, a crime that occurred in North Carolina has to take place in a North Carolina court, as opposed to, say, Virginia or South Carolina, and so forth. If a criminal commits a crime in one state, but crosses the border into another one, you are sent back to the state where the crime occurred. That's called extradition. So extradition, again, means you were sent back to where the crime originally occurred. So again, like if you rob a bank in North Carolina and drive into South Carolina and are arrested, they have to send you back to North Carolina. They don't, try you in South Carolina for the robbery in North Carolina. Other things they look for when they're resolving disputes. Who's got the most severe case? For example, again, like if I robbed a bank in North Carolina and shot a man in South Carolina usually gets the preference because murder is a much more significant crime than bank robbery. Sometimes another thing they'll use to determine jurisdiction is who's got more evidence. If, for example, again, to use that same example, if there's a lot more evidence of me robbing the bank than there is of me committing the murder, they'll oftentimes let the robbery go through because they'd rather me be found guilty of something than nothing. As for nationals versus states, again, it has to do with things like severity of the case, the amount of evidence in the case, which laws are broken. Those are about, again, the big things when it comes to resolving disputes when more than one person has the jurisdiction. Severity, location, and the amount of evidence is usually sort of the big deals. And of course, again, there are others as well. You obviously cannot have... if it involves constitutionality, you're talking about, say, a state Supreme Court or a U.S. Supreme Court. You're not going to deal with that in a local court. So those are all the big things that deal with jurisdiction. You start off then you go backwards and now talk a little bit about the state courts. At the state court level, the original jurisdiction is going to be called a trial court. The trial courts themselves have a ton of different names, but these are sort of, again, the lowest rung of a state court. Some of the names your book suggests. There's Superior Court, Probate Court, County Court, Municipal Court, Domestic Relations Court, which I'm not actually familiar with, the Justice of the Peace, the Magistrate. All of those fall into the same category, which is a state trial court. It's the original jurisdiction. It's where you are going to be brought forth. For example, here locally, it would be the Cumberland County Court. That is the original jurisdiction. That's the trial court for the state court level. So again, if you committed a crime in Fayetteville, you would likely be brought to the Cumberland County Court. If you feel that your case was done improperly at the trial court level, you can appeal and go up to the appellate courts. There is the state Supreme Court. There's also the state appeals court. There's the North Carolina Court of Appeals. There's the North Carolina Supreme Court. So it would go trial court, North Carolina Court of Appeals, North Carolina Supreme Court, and if you still are upset, then you could appeal from the North Carolina Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that is the top of the both chains. The U.S. Supreme Court is the very, very top. So again, trial court, North Carolina Court of Appeals, North Carolina Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. That's the chain of command on the state court level. The North Carolina Court of Appeals and the North Carolina Supreme Court, again, are only caring about the procedure of the trial. They don't actually care about guilt or innocence or anything like that. Meanwhile, the federal court level operates in a very similar pattern. The district court is the original jurisdiction for the federal level. The difference being is that the district courts are multi-state. There are 13 district courts. Off the top of my head, I believe that's correct. Nope, I'm wrong. I'm thinking of the courts of appeals. I'm sorry. There are 94 district courts. Sorry, it's late. 94 district courts in the U.S. So again, you divide up the country to 94 smaller districts. I think in North Carolina there are 3. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. There's like a west, a central, and an eastern. In any case, again, if you broke U.S. law, this is where they would try you. Once you go beyond, again, if the district court wasn't to your liking, you sue and you go to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, this is where there are only 12 of them. There are only 12 U.S. Courts of Appeals, and again, each one of these is multiple states and things like that. So, for example, it's like the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, I believe it is California, Washington, and Oregon, that region. We're in one that's like North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, I think. It's a weird collection. Again, you can look it up online. If you don't like the U.S. Court of Appeals' ruling, then you can appeal it further, and it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's the order of events there. It goes from District Court to U.S. Court of Appeals to U.S. Supreme Court. The judges at the federal level are they are appointed, by the President and approved by Congress. And this gets you to judicial selection. How these judges are chosen is a bit like we'll talk about in the next section with Supreme Court justices. But for the most part, these guys are chosen based on merit. So these are outstanding judges, outstanding lawyers. It's like a promotion for them. The only catch being that senators and congressmen from that state or district get final approval. They get sort of the veto power and so forth. So, for example, the senator from North Carolina has the ability to say, no, I don't like that guy. I don't want him representing North Carolina's district. Or I don't like him on our Court of Appeals, etc. But otherwise, for selecting justices, you're mostly looking at merit. Really good judges from that area then get their, essentially, promotion to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Judges in the Courts of Appeals are oftentimes then selected to become Supreme Court justices. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's in the next section. So, that takes care of Roman numeral 4. Onwards now to Roman numeral 5, and it's a doozy.